husband manually breathed for a premature baby named Piper for 12 hours straight because the hospital administrator, Mr. Pinkett, refused to buy more ventilators, saying good nurses find solutions and some babies aren't meant to make it. We just bill insurance either way. But when my husband had to hand over to a new nurse at shift change, she couldn't keep the rhythm and Piper died. So I confronted Pinkett with recordings of him bragging about dead babies, bringing revenue until he got fired, but not before he tried to destroy every nurse who spoke up. My husband, a pediatric nurse of 19 years, came home at dawn and went straight to our bedroom closet. I heard metal clinking, and when I went to check on him, I found him cutting up his scrubs with scissors. He was destroying everything with the hospital logo on it. His excellence pins, his NICU certification badge, even the photo of him holding the premature triplets he'd helped save. It took me 2 hours of sitting with him on our bedroom floor before he could speak. 3 nights ago, his unit had received 4 sets of premature twins within 2 hours. The NICU only had capacity for 12 babies. They already had 10. But the administrator, Mr. Pinkett, had accepted all 4 sets anyway. 8 more babies, only 2 spots. My husband had explained they didn't have enough ventilators. Mr. Pinkett's response was sharp. Good nurses find solutions. Work smarter, not harder. The first set of twins were born at 26 weeks. Their lungs were like paper. Both needed ventilators immediately. The second set came minutes later, 24 weeks, even more fragile. Then the third and fourth sets arrived. My husband counted the ventilators again. 8 babies who couldn't breathe alone. 6 available machines. He ran to Pinkett's office and begged for emergency transfers to other hospitals. Pinkett laughed at him. You think I'm turning away paying customers? Their insurance already approved us. Make it work. My husband explained that babies would die without enough ventilators. Pinkett leaned back in his leather chair. That's why I hired experienced nurses to handle challenges. My husband had to make an impossible choice. He paired the strongest twin from each set with the weakest. 4 ventilators for 8 babies. He and another nurse would have to manually bag breathe for the other 4. Every squeeze of the bag pushed air into tiny lungs. Stop squeezing, they stop breathing. No breaks, no pauses, not even to scratch your nose. For 12 hours straight, my husband manually breathed for baby girl Piper, 24 weeks old, 1 pound and 3 ounces. Her twin brother was on the ventilator beside her. My husband's hands cramped and shook, but he kept squeezing. The rhythm became everything. Squeeze, release, release. Her tiny chest rose and fell with his movements. The other nurse, Janet, was bagging baby boy Josh. His twin sister had the ventilator. Janet had been a nurse for 30 years, but I could see her struggling. My husband watched her hands slow down when exhaustion hit. He'd call out to keep her rhythm steady. They couldn't stop. These babies' hearts hit only because their hands kept moving. At shift change, everything fell apart. The day nurse coming in was new, only 2 months in NICU. She'd never manually ventilated for more than minutes. My husband tried to explain the rhythm while still bagging. The precise pressure needed. Too hard and you damage the lungs. Too soft and they don't get enough air. The new nurse's hands were shaking before she even took over. My husband had to let go and trust her. He'd been breathing for baby Piper for 12 hours. His replacement took the bag. Within minutes, my husband heard the alarms. The new nurse was squeezing too fast, panicking. Baby Piper's oxygen levels dropped, then her heart rate. My husband rushed back, but it was too late. Time of death was 7:23 a.m. 1 pound, 3 ounces, 12 hours old. The worst part was walking past Mr. Pinkett's office afterward. He was on the phone bragging about their admission numbers. 8 more premies last night. That's $500,000 in billing right there. He saw my husband in the hallway and gave him a thumbs up, like he'd done something good, like baby Piper hadn't died for his profit margins. My husband had to tell the Piper family. The mother was still recovering from her emergency C-section. She asked if her daughter had suffered. My husband lied and said no, but he knew those last minutes of incorrect ventilation had been agony. The baby had been aware. She'd fought to breathe. Her tiny fingers had clenched and unclenched, looking for comfort that never came. That evening, Mr. Pinkett sent an email to all staff. Great job managing resources last night. This is the kind of creative problem solving that makes us leaders in neonatal care. He announced they'd be accepting even more transfers. The board was impressed with the revenue increase. My husband threw up in the staff bathroom. After my husband finished cutting up his scrubs, he showed me something on his phone. 3 weeks ago, he'd started recording conversations with Pinkett. He knew something like this would happen. He had Pinkett on tape saying, some babies aren't meant to make it. We just bill insurance either way. He had him admitting they could buy more ventilators, but chose not to. Why buy equipment that sits empty half the time? I spent yesterday making copies of everything. The recordings, the emails, the admission records showing overcapacity. My husband was done being quiet. Done letting Pinkett play God with babies' lives for money. This morning, I drove to the hospital and waited for Pinkett in the parking garage. I told him my husband had been recording him for weeks. I showed him my phone with the files ready to send. His face went from smug to terrified in seconds. He stepped back, his hand reaching for his phone. I could see him calculating, trying to figure out if I was bluffing. The parking garage felt smaller suddenly, the concrete walls pressing in as morning shift workers walked past us toward the hospital entrance. Mr. Pinkett's jaw tightened. He glanced around the garage, then moved closer to my car. His cologne was overwhelming, the same expensive scent that filled his office when my husband begged him for more ventilators. I kept my phone visible, thumb hovering over the send button. He straightened his tie, that same burgundy one he wore to board meetings, the kind of tie that cost more than a week of my husband's salary. His voice dropped low, controlled. He asked what I wanted. I wanted baby Piper alive. I wanted my husband to stop waking up at 3 a.m., hands cramping from phantom ventilation movements. I wanted those other babies to have had a chance. But what I told him was simple. He needed to resign. Today. His laugh echoed off the concrete, a sharp, dismissive sound. He informed me that I clearly didn't understand how hospitals worked, that my husband was emotional, burnt out, that no one would believe a grieving nurse over a respected administrator with 20 years experience. I pulled up the first recording. His voice filled my car, tinny through the phone speaker, but clear enough. Some babies aren't meant to make it. We just bill insurance either way. His face changed. The confidence cracked just for a moment. He reached for my phone. I pulled it back, nearly dropping it. My hands were shaking, but I kept them steady enough to navigate to the email draft. 32 recipients, board members, department heads, the regional director. One tap, and they'd all hear him bragging about dead babies bringing in revenue. Mr. Pinkett's breathing changed. Shorter, sharper breaths. He loosened his tie. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. He started talking faster. About my husband's career. About how nurses who cause trouble don't last long in this industry. About references and blacklists and connections he had at every hospital hospital in the state. I thought about my husband on our bedroom floor, scissors in hand, destroying 19 years of dedication. The way his voice broke when he described Piper's tiny fingers clenching, how he'd dry heaved in our bathroom after his shift, nothing left in his stomach but still retching from the memory. Mr. Pinkett moved closer. His hand landed on my car door, blocking me in. He leaned down, speaking directly through my window. He told me my husband had made errors, that the baby's death was due to negligent care, that he had documentation ready to file with the nursing board if needed. My husband would lose his license. We'd lose our house. Our savings would go to legal fees. My finger moved toward the send button. He saw it, and his hand slammed against my window. Not hard enough to break it, but hard enough to make me jump. Two nurses walking by glanced over, then hurried past. Everyone knew better than to get involved with Mr. Pinkett. He composed himself, smoothing his hair back. Then he made an offer. My husband could transfer to another unit. Day shift, better hours, a small raise even. All I had to do was delete those recordings. Pretend this conversation never happened. Let him continue running the NICU his way. I thought about the other babies, the ones who would come next week, next month. More twins, more triplets, more tiny lives depending on having enough equipment. More nurses forced to play God, choosing which baby got the ventilator and which one got manual breathing. More 7:23 a.m.s. More mothers asking if their babies suffered. Mr. Pinkett checked his watch. An expensive thing with too many dials. He had a board meeting in an hour, he said. They were voting on expanding the NICU, taking in even more transfers. The profit margins were too good to pass up. He smiled when he said it. The same smile from the hallway when he gave my husband that thumbs up. I started the car. He had to step back or get his foot run over. His face flushed red, then purple. He pointed at me through the windshield, mouthing words I couldn't hear over the engine. I rolled down my window just enough to speak. I told him he had until 5 p.m. resignation letter on the board's desk, or everyone would hear the recordings. Not just the board, the state health department, the insurance companies he'd been defrauding, the families of every baby who died on his watch. He yelled something about lawyers, about defamation, about ruining us. I drove away, watching him shrink in my rearview mirror. I wonder what really drove Pinkett to accept those 8 babies when he knew they only had 6 ventilators. There's something deeper than just money here, isn't there? The way he gave that thumbs up after Piper died makes me curious about what goes through someone's mind in that moment. A man in an expensive suit, standing alone in a parking garage, finally understanding what it felt like to be powerless. At home, my husband was at the kitchen table, still in his pajamas, staring at his phone. He'd been reading old text messages from his NICU group chat, pictures of babies who made it, success stories, graduation photos from families whose premature infants were now healthy toddlers. His eyes were red. I told him about the parking garage, about Pinkett's threats, his offers, his desperation. My husband's hands clenched and unclenched, the same motion he'd made for 12 hours straight trying to keep Piper alive. He asked what would happen if Pinkett didn't resign. We both knew the answer. Pinkett had connections, lawyers, ways to twist the truth. My husband could lose everything he'd worked for. We could end up bankrupt from legal fees, but we also knew what would happen if we stayed quiet. More babies, more deaths, more families destroyed for profit margins. The morning passed slowly. My husband couldn't eat. He organized our closet, then reorganized it, folded and refolded the remaining clothes. Anything to keep his hands busy. I made copies of the recordings on 3 different drives, uploaded them to cloud storage, prepared emails to journalists just in case. At 2 p.m., my husband's phone rang. Janet, the nurse who'd been bagging baby Josh that night. Her voice was strained. Pinkett had called an emergency staff meeting. Mandatory attendance. He was asking questions about that night, about who might have been recording, about loyalty and team players and consequences for spreading lies about the hospital. My husband got dressed. His hands shook as he buttoned his shirt. Not his scrubs. Those were in pieces in our garbage. Just regular clothes. He looked smaller without his hospital badge, without his pins showing years of excellence. Just a man who'd tried to save lives and been broken by a system that valued money more than miracles. I drove him to the hospital. He had to be at that meeting, had to face Pinkett one more time. As we pulled into the same parking garage, we saw Pinkett's car, still in his reserved spot near the elevator, still planning to fight us. My husband squeezed my hand before getting out. His wedding ring caught the light, the same ring he'd worn while manually ventilating baby Piper, while making impossible choices, while watching her die at 7:23 a.m. He walked toward the hospital entrance, shoulders straight, ready for whatever came next. I waited in the car, phone ready, the recordings queued up, watching the clock move toward 5 p.m., wondering if Pinkett would call our bluff, if he'd really risk everything to keep his position, if his greed was stronger than his self-preservation. At 3:47 p.m., my phone buzzed. A text from Janet. Pinkett was in his office with 2 board members, door closed, voices raised. She could hear him through the walls, getting louder, getting desperate. The meeting had been canceled. At 4:15 p.m., my husband texted. Pinkett had just walked past the NICU. No swagger, no expensive cologne trail, just a man carrying a cardboard box, security beside him. The nurses were whispering. No one knew exactly what happened, but everyone knew something had shifted. At 4:52 p.m., I got an email from the chairman of the hospital board. A brief message. Mr. Pinkett had submitted his resignation, effective immediately. The board would be reviewing NICU policies and equipment needs. They thanked me for bringing concerns to their attention. I sat in that parking garage until my husband's shift ended. Other nurses walked past my car throughout the afternoon. Some nodded at me, some smiled. Word traveled fast in hospitals. They knew what we'd risked, what we'd almost lost, what we'd finally won. When my husband finally emerged at 7:30 p.m., he looked different, lighter. He slid into the passenger seat and we sat in silence for a moment. Then he told me about the rest of his shift, how the NICU felt different without Pinkett's presence looming, how nurses were already talking about the equipment they actually needed, how the temporary administrator had asked for a real assessment of safe capacity. We drove home as the sun set, past the cemetery where baby Piper was buried, past the church where her parents had held her memorial, past all the places that marked our city's grief. My husband reached over and took my hand. His grip was steady. No more trembling, no more phantom movements. That night, he pulled out his nursing textbooks, the ones from 19 years ago, covered in dust. He spread them on our kitchen table next to his laptop, started looking up recertification courses, refresher training, ways to be better, stronger, more prepared for the next time someone tried to put profits over patients. I made him dinner while he studied. Real food, not the crackers and water he'd been living on since that night. He ate slowly, telling me about new protocols he wanted to propose, about equipment grants they could apply for, about the changes that were already starting. The phone rang at midnight. My husband husband jerked awake, his hand automatically reaching for it. Old habits from years of on-call shifts. I watched him answer, his face changing as he listened. He hung up without speaking and sat on the edge of our bed, head in his hands. Janet had been suspended. Effective immediately. Pending investigation into patient care standards during the night baby Piper died. My husband's hand started that familiar clenching motion again. He got up and paced our bedroom, his bare feet silent on the carpet. I found the official notice in my email 10 minutes later. My husband was required to attend a formal review board meeting in 3 days. The subject line made my stomach drop. Investigation into negligent patient care, resulting in infant mortality. They were blaming him for Piper's death. My husband spent the rest of the night at our kitchen table, writing down every detail from that shift. Times, names, who was where, what resources they had. His handwriting got shakier as the hours passed. By dawn, he had 20 pages of notes, every minute accounted for, every impossible decision documented. The next morning, I drove to the hospital while my husband slept. I needed to understand what was happening. The parking garage felt different now, hostile. I found Janet's car in the employee lot. She was sitting inside, still wearing her scrubs from the night before. Her face was puffy from crying. She showed me her suspension letter. The language was careful, clinical, but the meaning was clear. She was being scapegoated for following Pinkett's orders, for doing the impossible with inadequate resources. The letter mentioned documentation irregularities, failure to properly chart during critical care. They were building a case. I asked about the emergency meeting my husband had attended. Janet's laugh was bitter. Pinkett had stood at the front of the conference room, explaining how concerned he was about recent events, how patient safety was paramount, how any nurse who couldn't handle the pressure should speak up. He'd looked directly at my husband when he said it. Then Pinkett had introduced the new documentation requirements. Every interaction with critical patients now needed triple verification, forms that would take 30 minutes to complete for each baby, time they didn't have when manually ventilating. It was designed to be impossible, to create more failures he could document. Janet pulled out her phone and showed me a text thread. Other nurses from that night. They were all being questioned, their patient care histories reviewed, years of exemplary service suddenly under scrutiny. Pinkett was systematically targeting everyone who'd witnessed his admission decisions. I left Janet in her car and walked into the hospital. I needed to see what was happening in the NICU. The security guard at the entrance knew me, had for years, but he stopped me. New policy. No non-essential visitors in critical care areas. His eyes were apologetic, but firm. Orders from administration. Through the glass doors, I could see the NICU. Nurses moving between incubators. The soft glow of warming lights. The constant dance of care that my husband had performed for 19 years. But something was different. The nurses looked hunched, worried. They kept glancing toward the administrative offices. I took the elevator to the 5th floor, the administrative wing. Pinkett's office was at the end of the hall, corner windows overlooking the city. His secretary, Mrs. Chen, had worked there for 15 years. She'd always been kind to my husband, sending cards when our children were born. Mrs. Chen wasn't at her desk. A younger woman sat there instead, someone I'd never seen. She looked up when I approached, her smile professional but cold. She informed me that Mr. Pinkett was in meetings all day, that appointments needed to be scheduled through proper channels, that I should leave. I heard Pinkett's voice through his office door, loud, confident, the same tone from the recordings on my phone. He was on a conference call, discussing staffing changes, efficiency improvements, how he was addressing the recent incident with comprehensive policy updates. No mention of inadequate equipment, no acknowledgement of his role. The new secretary stood up, moving between me and the door. She suggested I leave before security was called. Her hand hovered over her phone. I memorized her face, the way she positioned herself. Another piece of Pinkett's protection system. Another barrier between him and consequences. Back in the parking garage, I sat in my car and checked my phone. 3 missed calls from my husband, 2 from numbers I didn't recognize, 1 voicemail. I played it, my hands tightening on the steering wheel as I listened. A lawyer, representing the hospital's interests, wanting to discuss the situation with my husband. How does Pinkett still have so much power even after resigning? The way he's targeting Janet and building these impossible documentation rules. It's like watching someone set clever traps while pretending to help, offering to meet, to explain their position, to find a mutually beneficial resolution. The subtext was clear. They wanted to contain this, to make it go away quietly. I drove home to find my husband in our backyard, pulling weeds with violent efficiency. Our garden, usually his pride, had been neglected since that night. Now he attacked it like the earth had personally wronged him. Dirt flew, roots tore, his movements were sharp, angry. He'd gotten a call too, from the nursing board. A formal complaint had been filed, his license was under review. 19 years of saving lives, and now they were questioning his competence based on one night of impossible circumstances. One night when he'd been forced to play God because Pinkett wanted profit. We sat on our porch as the sun climbed higher. My husband's hands were filthy from the garden, dirt caked under his nails. He kept rubbing them together, trying to get them clean, the same hands that had kept Piper alive for 12 hours. That had maintained perfect rhythm despite exhaustion and cramping. The mail arrived early, official letterhead from the hospital's legal department. They were conducting an internal investigation. My husband was placed on administrative leave pending its completion. No pay, no access to hospital facilities, no contact with other staff members during the investigation. Effective immediately. My husband read the letter 3 times. Then he walked inside and came back with a lighter. I watched him burn it in our metal trash can, the official words turning to ash and smoke. His face was calm, but his jaw kept clenching, the muscle jumping under his skin. That afternoon, I drove to Janet's house. She lived in a small ranch 2 towns over, the kind nurses could afford on a single income. Her car was in the driveway, but she didn't answer the door. I walked around to the back and found her on her deck, staring at nothing. She'd been served too. Same letter, same suspension. 30 years of night shifts, of saving babies others had given up on, reduced to administrative leave and legal threats. She showed me her phone. 17 missed calls from coworkers. Everyone afraid to actually speak, but wanting to show support somehow. Janet had kept her own records, not recordings like my husband, but detailed notes. Every time Pinkett had pushed them past safe ratios. Every admission that exceeded capacity. Every corner they'd been forced to cut. 3 notebooks full of careful documentation. She'd been building her case for years. We spent 2 hours going through her notes, matching dates with my husband's recordings, building a timeline of Pinkett's decisions. The pattern was clear. Admissions spiked whenever quarterly reports were due. Safety protocols were ignored during budget reviews. Babies became numbers on a spreadsheet. Janet's neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, brought us tea. She'd heard about the suspensions through the hospital grapevine. Her daughter worked in pediatric ICU ICU, 1 floor down from NICU. The whole hospital was talking. Nurses were scared. If Pinkett could destroy careers like this, who was safe? I left Janet's house with copies of everything. 3 years of documentation. Names, dates, times, proof that this wasn't isolated. That baby Piper was just the latest casualty of Pinkett's profit-driven decisions. My car felt heavier driving home, weighted with evidence and responsibility. My husband was in our bedroom when I returned, ironing his one good suit. The review board meeting was tomorrow. He decided to attend despite our lawyer's advice to postpone. He needed to face them, to speak for Piper and all the others. His movements were precise, methodical, the iron gliding over fabric with practiced care. I spread Janet's documentation across our dining room table. My husband read through it silently, his face growing harder with each page. Here was proof, not just one bad night, but a pattern of deliberate endangerment. Pinkett's signature on every admission that pushed them past capacity. We worked until midnight, organizing everything, creating a clear narrative. The hospital had given us 48 hours to respond to the suspension. We'd use every minute. My husband typed while I arranged supporting documents. Our printer ran constantly, spitting out pages of evidence. The house felt different with my husband home during what should be his shift. He kept checking the time, his body still programmed for night work. At 3 a.m., he was standing at our kitchen window, staring toward the hospital, wondering who was working tonight, whether they had enough staff, whether babies were safe. Morning came too soon. My husband dressed carefully in his suit, adjusting his tie multiple times. He'd worn it to award ceremonies, to funerals, to our children's graduations. Now he wore it to fight for his career, for his right to save lives, for justice for a 1-pound baby who'd trusted him to breathe for her. I drove him to the hospital for the review board meeting, the same building where he'd worked for 19 years, where he'd celebrated successful surgeries and mourned inevitable losses, where he'd been forced to choose which babies lived and which ones struggled. Now he entered as a suspected negligent caregiver. The meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. in the executive conference room, wood paneling and leather chairs, the kind of room where budgets were approved and staff was terminated. My husband carried a box of documentation, evidence of systemic failures, proof that Piper's death was Pinkett's responsibility, not his. I waited in the lobby, 3 hours of watching hospital staff pass by. Some recognized me, offering awkward smiles or avoiding eye contact entirely. The news had spread. Everyone knew about the suspensions, about Pinkett's investigation, about careers being destroyed to protect profit margins. A security guard I'd known for years approached me. Robert had worked nights for a decade, often chatting with my husband during quiet moments. He sat beside me, pretending to check his phone. He whispered that Pinkett had hired 2 new administrators, both with backgrounds in efficiency optimization, both known for cutting costs and staff. Robert told me about the new policies, documentation requirements that added hours to each shift, staffing ratios that pushed legal limits. Nurses were already leaving, transferring to other hospitals. The ones who stayed were scared. Pinkett was reshaping the entire department, erasing anyone who might speak up. My husband emerged at noon, his face unreadable. The review board had listened. They'd asked questions. They'd taken his documentation, but their focus remained on that night, on the minutes when baby Piper died, on whether proper procedures were followed during an impossible situation. They'd promised a decision within 5 days. We drove home in silence. My husband loosened his tie as soon as we left the parking garage. His hands were steady, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. The weight of 19 years versus one terrible night. The knowledge that Pinkett was still there, still making decisions, still playing God with tiny lives. That evening, our phone rang constantly. Other nurses calling to offer support. Former colleagues sharing their own stories of Pinkett's administration. Each call added another piece to the pattern. Nurses forced to work unsafe ratios. Equipment requests denied. Concerns dismissed. A culture of profit over patience, enforced through fear. My husband sat at our kitchen table listening to each story, taking notes, building a case that went beyond one night, beyond one baby. This was about a system that valued billing over breathing, about an administrator who saw NICU beds as revenue streams instead of life support. The next morning brought another letter, this time from Pinkett himself, on hospital letterhead. He expressed concern about my husband's recent struggles, offered resources for stress management, suggested that perhaps 19 years of high-intensity care had taken its toll. The implication was clear. Frame this as burnout, as mental health issues, and maybe they'd go easy on him. My husband crumpled the letter and threw it across our kitchen. It hit the wall and fell behind the trash can. His first real display of anger since that night. He retrieved it, smoothed it out, and added it to our evidence file. Another piece of Pinkett's manipulation. Another attempt to control the narrative. I spent the day making more copies of everything. The recordings, Janet's notes, the suspension letters. I opened a safety deposit box at 3 different banks, uploaded files to secure cloud storage, created email drafts ready to send to journalists, state regulators, anyone who might listen. Pinkett had power, but we had truth. My husband couldn't sit still. He cleaned our garage, reorganized his tools, fixed the squeaky hinge on our back door that had annoyed us for months. Anything to keep his hands busy, to avoid thinking about the empty NICU station where he should be working, about the babies who needed experienced nurses while he sat suspended at home. That night, Janet called. Her voice was different, scared. Someone had been to her house while she was at the grocery store. Nothing stolen, but things were moved. Her notebooks repositioned, her computer left open. A message that they were watching, that her documentation wasn't as secret as she thought. We met at a coffee shop the next morning, neutral ground. Janet's hands shook as she held her cup. 30 years of steady hands in the NICU, now trembling over coffee. She'd found a lawyer, someone who specialized in whistleblower cases, but the retainer was more than she could afford, more than any nurse could afford. I showed her our evidence file, the recordings that proved Pinkett's callousness, the documentation that showed patterns, the letters that revealed his manipulation. Together we had enough. Pinkett's playing chess while everyone else is trying to save lives, sending concern letters about burnout while secretly rearranging Janet's notebooks like some medical mafia boss with a master's degree. Enough to show that baby Piper's death wasn't negligence. It was murder by administrative decision, murder by profit margin. Janet's lawyer had given her advice. Document everything. Keep copies off-site. Be prepared for escalation. Pinkett wouldn't go quietly. He'd use every tool, every connection, every resource to protect himself, to destroy anyone who threatened his position. We were just nurses and family. He was administration with 20 years of connections. We spent 3 hours strategizing. Who else might have evidence? Which nurses would speak up despite the risk? How to protect ourselves while fighting back? The coffee shop filled and emptied around us. Normal people living living normal lives while we planned how to take down a man who culled babies for profit. I drove home from the coffee shop with Janet's notebooks beside me. My husband was in our driveway, washing his car. Another displacement activity. The suds ran down the windshield as he scrubbed spots that were already clean. His movements were mechanical, repetitive, the same precision he'd used to keep Piper alive. That afternoon, we received certified mail. The review board's preliminary findings. They'd identified 17 documentation errors from that night. Missing timestamps, incomplete vitals charts, all the paperwork my husband couldn't complete while manually breathing for a baby. Each error listed as evidence of negligence. My husband sat at our kitchen table, reading through each citation. His face remained blank, but his knuckles went white, gripping the pages. 19 years of perfect documentation, and they were using one impossible night to destroy him. I watched him fold the letter carefully, placing it with our growing evidence file. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. 3 nurses from the NICU stood on our porch. They'd taken personal days to come. They handed my husband a folder. Inside were their own documentation from that night, charts showing the impossible patient ratios, photos of the overcrowded unit, their own written statements about Pinkett's admission decisions. One nurse, Sarah, had worked with my husband for 15 years. She showed us her resignation letter, already submitted. She couldn't work under Pinkett anymore. Couldn't watch more babies die for profit. 2 other nurses had already left. More were planning their exits. The NICU was hemorrhaging experienced staff. We spent the morning reviewing their evidence. Each page added weight to our case, but it also showed the cost. These nurses were risking their careers by speaking up. Their mortgages, their children's college funds, their entire livelihoods hung in the balance. Pinkett had created a culture where saving babies meant sacrificing yourself. That evening, Janet arrived at our house. Her face was pale, hands trembling worse than before. She'd received a letter from the hospital's lawyers. They were pursuing damages for her breach of confidentiality in keeping personal notes about hospital operations. The amount they demanded would bankrupt her. My husband poured Janet tea while I read the letter. Legal intimidation disguised as procedure. They wanted her documentation destroyed, wanted her silence bought through fear. The letterhead was the same one that had announced my husband's suspension, the same cold clinical language that reduced human lives to liability concerns. We worked through the night, organizing everything, the recordings, the photos, the statements, building an airtight case that showed the truth. My husband's hands moved steadily now, no more trembling. He had purpose again, not saving babies directly, but fighting for the system that should protect them. The next day, I drove to the hospital alone. The security guard, Robert, met me in the parking garage. He handed me an envelope, glancing around nervously. Inside were internal memos from Pinkett, budget projections showing profit increases from overcrowding, emails discussing acceptable loss ratios for premature infants. Robert explained that other staff members were collecting evidence too. Maintenance workers who'd been denied requests for ventilator repairs, supply clerks who'd been told to delay equipment orders, everyone who'd been forced to compromise safety for Pinkett's bottom line. The rebellion was quiet but growing. I sat in my car, reading through Robert's documents. Each memo was another nail in Pinkett's coffin, but I also saw his counterattack forming. New policies that made documentation impossible, suspension threats for anyone who questioned procedures. He was tightening his grip, trying to silence opposition through bureaucracy. Back home, my husband was on the phone with former colleagues. Word had spread beyond our hospital. Nurses from other facilities were sharing similar stories. Administrators who valued profits over patients. Systems designed to maximize billing while minimizing care. Pinkett wasn't unique. He was just the one we'd caught on tape. That night, we received another visit. Dr. Martinez, the head of pediatrics, stood at our door. He'd been at the hospital for 25 years, delivered thousands of babies. He looked exhausted, older than his 60 years. He came inside and sat heavily in our living room chair. He told us about the board meeting he'd just left. Pinkett had presented a new efficiency plan, reducing nurse-to-patient ratios even further, cutting redundant equipment, maximizing bed turnover. The board had approved it unanimously. They saw numbers, not babies. Profit margins, not pulse rates. Dr. Martinez pulled out his own envelope, his resignation letter, effective in 2 weeks. He couldn't be part of it anymore. Couldn't watch Pinkett turn the NICU into a factory. He gave us names of board members who might listen, people who still remembered that hospitals existed to heal, not earn. The next morning, Janet called early. Her voice was different, stronger. She'd made a decision. She was going to the state nursing board with everything. The documentation, the intimidation, all of it. If they wanted to destroy her career, she'd make sure everyone knew why. We met at her house to prepare. My husband helped her organize 30 years of evidence, patient records showing impossible assignments, incident reports that were buried, staffing schedules that violated state regulations, each document carefully copied, verified, prepared for submission. As we worked, Janet told us about other nurses who'd tried to speak up over the years, the ones who'd been transferred, terminated, blacklisted. Pinkett had been building his empire for 2 decades, crushing opposition with bureaucratic precision, but he'd never faced someone with nothing left to lose. That afternoon, I drove my husband to meet with Dr. Martinez and 3 other doctors. They gathered in Martinez's home office, away from hospital surveillance. These were the rebels, the ones who still believed in their oath. They shared their own evidence of Pinkett's policies causing harm. One doctor, Dr. Kim, had been documenting infant mortality rates. The numbers had spiked since Pinkett took over. Not dramatically enough to trigger automatic reviews, but enough to notice if you were looking. Babies who might have survived with proper resources. Lives lost to profit margins. They discussed strategy late into the evening. How to present the evidence to board members who would listen. Which state agencies had the power to investigate. How to protect the nurses who were speaking up. It felt like planning a revolution, which in a way, it was. The next day brought the review board's final decision. My husband's nursing license was suspended pending further investigation. 19 years of saving lives, reduced to a single paragraph of bureaucratic judgment. The letter recommended he seek counseling for burnout and consider alternative career paths. My husband read it once, then filed it with arrest. His face showed no emotion, but I saw his hands clench. The same hands that had kept Piper alive for 12 hours, that had saved countless babies over 2 decades, now deemed unfit by administrators who'd never held a struggling newborn. That evening, we had a meeting at our house. Janet, Dr. Martinez, Sarah, and 5 other nurses. We spread our evidence across the dining room table. Recordings, documents, testimonies, proof of systematic negligence driven by greed. The question was how to use it. Dr. Martinez had contacted a board member he trusted, Dr. Patricia Patricia Chen, who'd been a NICU nurse herself decades ago. She'd agreed to review our evidence privately. If she was convinced, she'd push for an emergency board review. It was our best shot at stopping Pinkett through proper channels. We spent hours preparing a presentation, clear, factual, devastating. My husband's recordings as the centerpiece, supported by years of documentation. We practiced what to say, how to present it without emotion clouding the facts, how to make them see babies instead of numbers. The meeting was scheduled for the next evening. Dr. Chen would meet us at her home, away from hospital politics. We had one chance to convince her, one opportunity to break through the bureaucracy and reach someone with power to act. Everything depended on her response. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Piper's parents, about the lie my husband told them, that their daughter hadn't suffered, about all the parents who'd never know their babies died for profit. The weight of truth felt heavier than any physical burden. The next morning, Pinkett made his move, a hospital-wide email announcing new quality assurance measures. Any staff member discussing patient care outside official channels would face immediate termination. Any documentation kept outside hospital systems would be considered theft of proprietary information. He was closing every avenue of opposition. My husband read the email without comment. Then he went to our closet and pulled out his one good suit again, the same one he'd worn to the review board. He laid it out carefully, checking for wrinkles. Tonight's meeting with Dr. Chen might be our last chance. He would dress for battle. I spent the day making final preparations, copying files to multiple drives, preparing packages for state regulators in case Dr. Chen wouldn't help, writing down names and dates and the endless small cruelties that had led to this moment. My hands moved automatically, like my husband's had that night with Piper. Janet arrived early that evening. She wore her best dress, the one from her nursing school graduation 30 years ago. Sarah came next, then Dr. Martinez. We gathered our evidence, checked our presentation one final time. Everyone understood the stakes, our careers, our futures, balanced against babies' lives. The drive to Dr. Chen's house felt endless. My husband sat beside me, our box of evidence between us. His breathing was steady, controlled, the same rhythm he'd used to keep Piper alive. I reached over and took his hand. His wedding ring caught the streetlight, a reminder of vows taken and kept. Dr. Chen lived in an older neighborhood, tree-lined streets and modest homes. Her porch light was on, waiting for us. We filed inside, carrying our burden of truth. Her living room became our courtroom, her coffee table our evidence display. She sat across from us, waiting. My husband spoke first. Clear, precise, factual. He described that night, the impossible choices, Piper's death. Then he played the recordings. Pinkett's voice filled the room, casual in its cruelty. Dr. Chen's face remained neutral, but her hands tightened on her coffee cup. Janet presented her documentation next. 3 decades of patterns, escalating danger, profits over patients. Sarah added the staffing records, the impossible ratios, the experienced nurses driven away. Dr. Martinez concluded with mortality statistics, the cold numbers that represented warm lives lost. Dr. Chen reviewed everything methodically. She asked pointed questions, verified dates, checked documentation. 2 hours passed in careful examination. Finally, she set down the last page and looked at us. Her next words would determine everything. She had been suspicious of the mortality rates herself, had questioned Pinkett's policies in board meetings, only to be overruled by profit projections. But she'd never had proof, never had the ammunition to fight back. Now we'd given her weapons. She would call an emergency board meeting within 48 hours. We left her house with cautious hope. Dr. Chen had taken copies of everything, promised to present it forcefully, but we'd learned not to trust promises from administrators. We drove home in silence, each lost in thoughts of what came next. The dice were cast, the evidence submitted. Now we waited. The next day passed in tense preparation. We knew Pinkett would hear about the emergency meeting, knew he'd marshal his defenses, prepare his counterattacks. My husband spent the day with our lawyer, preparing for the worst, protecting our assets in case of lawsuits, planning for unemployment. That evening, Dr. Chen called. The emergency board meeting was set for tomorrow night. 5 board members had agreed to attend, enough for a quorum. She'd shared key pieces of evidence, enough to ensure they'd come. The showdown we'd been building toward was finally here. I barely slept that night. Neither did my husband. We lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Piper, about the other babies who'd died, about the ones still at risk. Tomorrow would determine whether their deaths meant something, whether the system could still be saved. The next morning, Pinkett struck back. Letters arrived by courier for everyone involved. Cease and desist orders, threats of defamation lawsuits, financial damages that would destroy us all. His lawyers had worked through the night, building walls of legal intimidation, but we were past the point of backing down. We spent the day in final preparations. Our lawyer reviewed Pinkett's threats, assured us they were mostly bluster. Truth was still a defense against defamation. We had evidence, documentation, recordings. If Pinkett wanted a legal fight, we were ready, but we hoped the board would act first. As evening approached, we gathered again, the same group, plus 2 more nurses who'd found courage to join us. We wouldn't be in the board meeting, but we'd be nearby, ready to provide additional evidence if needed, ready to support Dr. Chen however we could. My husband wore his suit again. I helped him with his tie, the simple domestic ritual grounding us before the storm. His hands were steady now, no trembling, no clenching. He'd found his purpose again, not in saving individual babies, but in fixing the system that failed them. We drove to the hospital as the sun set, the same parking garage where I'd first confronted Pinkett, where this journey began. We parked and waited, watching board members arrive, each expensive car another vote that would determine the future. Dr. Chen texted updates from inside. The meeting lasted 4 hours. 4 hours of evidence, arguments, Pinkett's desperate defenses. We sat in our car, holding hands, waiting for word. Other staff members had gathered too. Cars scattered throughout the garage, all waiting for the same news. A quiet vigil for justice. At 11:47 p.m., Dr. Chen emerged. Even from a distance, we could see her exhaustion. She walked to our car, each step measured. Her face gave nothing away until she reached us. Then finally, she smiled. The board had voted. Pinkett was terminated, effective immediately. But that wasn't all. The board had approved emergency funding for new equipment, had mandated safe staffing ratios, had ordered a full review of admission policies. Everything we'd fought for, everything Piper had died for, was finally happening. The system could be healed. My husband broke down then. 19 years of professional composure cracked. He sobbed in our car, grieving for Piper and all the others, releasing the weight he'd carried since that night. I held him as other staff members surrounded our car, crying and cheering simultaneously. The next days blurred together. Pinkett's office was cleared out. The intimidation letters stopped. The state nursing board reversed my husband's suspension after reviewing our evidence. evidence. Janet's legal threats evaporated. One by one, the weapons Pinkett had used against us fell away. New ventilators arrived within a week. Staffing schedules were revised to safe ratios. Dr. Martinez withdrew his resignation, agreed to help rebuild. The NICU began healing, returning to its true purpose: saving babies, not profits. My husband returned to work on a Tuesday morning, his new scrubs crisp and clean. The other nurses welcomed him back with tears and applause. He took his place at the warming table, checking equipment that was finally adequate. His hands moved with practiced confidence, ready to save lives again. That night, he came home at his normal time. No overtime forced by short staffing. No impossible choices between dying babies. He sat at our kitchen table and told me about his shift. 4 admissions, all properly equipped. Every baby breathing steadily. The NICU working as it should. We drove to the cemetery that weekend. My husband knelt at Piper's small grave, placing fresh flowers. He told her that her death had saved others, that the broken system that failed her was being repaired, that her 12 hours of life had meant something profound. Subscribe and like for more videos just like this. I love you all. Thanks so much.